The wind screamed through the empty fields, carrying icy shards of snow that cut like daggers against the skin. Trees stood bare and lifeless, their skeletal branches trembling in the ferocious gale. The road was silent, blanketed in white, a ribbon of isolation stretching into the endless cold. Somewhere along this desolate path a black SUV came to a stop, its rumbling engine the only sound in the frozen stillness. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his figure silhouetted against the bleak winter sky. Richard Halstead looked every part the picture of wealth. His tailored coat, polished boots, and leather gloves gleamed in the faint light. Yet his face wore an expression of irritation, his brows furrowed as he moved briskly to the back of the vehicle. With a click, the trunk opened, revealing a pitiful sight. 4 border collie puppies, barely 6 months old, huddled together under a thin blanket. Their black and white coats shimmered with innocence, their eyes wide and trusting. Yet Richard's gaze was cold, clinical, as he reached in and grabbed one by the scruff of its neck. It was the smallest of the litter, its frail body trembling violently. The puppy, later named Scout, whimpered softly as its legs dangled helplessly in the man's grasp. Its hind legs, crooked and weak, struggled to find balance even when it stood. Richard's mouth curled in disdain. "Useless," he muttered, his voice sharp and biting. "You'll never amount to anything." He carried the pup to the edge of the road, his boots crunching over the ice-crusted snow. Without hesitation, he dropped the puppy onto the frozen ground, its tiny body landing with a soft thud. Scout yelped, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. Snow seeped into its fur, its paws sinking into the ice as it struggled to stand. Richard paused, his gloved hands on his hips, as if contemplating some distant regret, but his face hardened. He turned, walked back to the SUV, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared into the blizzard. Left behind, Scout clawed at the snow, its movements desperate but feeble. The cold bit deeply, each gust of wind a cruel knife against its tiny body. Alone in the endless white, the puppy shivered violently, but somewhere deep within, a faint ember of hope refused to extinguish. The endless Montana plains stretched out like a frozen wasteland, the horizon blurred by falling snow. Mark Hudson drove his battered Ford F-150 down the lonely road, the old engine humming softly. He gripped the steering wheel with gloved hands, his breath fogging the inside of the windshield. The heater struggled to warm the truck's cab, but Mark barely noticed. His mind wandered, drifting back to memories of better times. It had been 2 years since the accident, a single moment that had shattered his world. His wife, Lily, and their 6-year-old daughter, Ellie, were gone, and with them, the laughter and light that once filled his life. Now his days were hollow routines at the garage, his nights spent in a quiet house that felt more like a tomb of memories. As he rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye, a dark shape against the blinding white. At first, he thought it was just trash blown in by the wind, but something about the way it lay half buried in the snow nagged at him. Mark slowed the truck and pulled over, his tires crunching loudly on the icy ground. Stepping out, the bitter wind hit him like a slap, cutting through his coat. He trudged toward the shape, each step sinking into the snow. When he got close enough to see what it was, his breath caught in his throat. It was a puppy. The tiny border collie lay motionless, its black and white fur matted with frost. Snowflakes had gathered on its coat, and its shallow breath sent faint puffs of steam into the air. Kneeling beside it, Mark's chest tightened. The dog's body trembled violently, its hind legs crooked and unsteady. Blood tinged the snow around its mouth and paws, signs of a desperate struggle to survive. "Hey there, little one," Mark murmured, his voice soft and full of concern. He reached out, brushing the frost from the puppy's fur. The dog flinched, but didn't have the strength to move. "You're freezing," Mark said, his throat tightening as he gently scooped the puppy into his arms. Its small body was alarmingly cold, like holding a block of ice. Cradling the pup close to his chest, he turned and hurried back to the truck. Inside, Mark cranked up the heater, the warm air blasting from the vents. He tucked the puppy under his coat, shielding it from the icy air. "You're okay now," he whispered, stroking its fur with trembling fingers. "I've got you." As he drove toward home, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the road in a suffocating white. But for the first time in years, Mark felt a spark of purpose burning through the winter cold. The warmth of the fireplace crackled softly in Mark Hudson's modest living room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The once empty house now carried a faint sense of life, even if it was only from the tiny creature lying on a soft towel near the hearth. Mark knelt beside the puppy, carefully wiping the dirt and frost from its matted fur with a warm, damp cloth. "There you go, little one," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. The puppy, still weak, barely moved, but let out a faint sigh of relief as the warmth began to thaw its frozen body. Mark inspected the dog's hind legs, his brow furrowing at their unnatural angle. He gently touched the limbs, noting the way they trembled under the slightest pressure. "You've had a rough start, haven't you?" he said, his tone tinged with both sadness and compassion. After wrapping the pup in an old flannel blanket, Mark carried it to the small bed he'd hastily set up by the fire. It was nothing fancy, just a box lined with soft towels, but it would have to do. He sat back on the worn couch, watching as the puppy's breathing steadied. For the next few days, Mark devoted himself to the little dog's care. He gave it small, warm meals, careful not to overwhelm its fragile stomach. The puppy began to respond, slowly but surely, with faint flickers of life. Its tail would twitch or its ears would perk up at the sound of Mark's voice. "Scout," Mark said one evening as he sat by the fire. The name came to him unexpectedly, but it felt right. "That's what I'll call you. You look like a fighter." Scout, as if understanding, blinked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't get too comfortable. I don't even know if I'm keeping you yet." But deep down, he knew better. Scout was already more than just a stray. As the days turned into weeks, Scout grew stronger. He still struggled with his legs, but his spirit was indomitable. Mark would often catch him wobbling around the living room, tail wagging furiously, as if determined to prove his resilience. Late at night, as the house grew quiet, Mark found himself talking to Scout. He spoke about his late wife, Lily, and their daughter, Ellie, about the emptiness that had consumed him since their passing. Scout would tilt his head, listening intently, as if he understood every word. And perhaps he did, because for the first time in years, the silence of Mark's home felt a little less oppressive. The crackling of the fire, the soft sound of Scout's breathing, and the gentle weight of his presence brought a kind of comfort Mark hadn't thought possible. "You saved me as much as I saved you, didn't you?" Mark whispered one night, stroking Scout's soft fur. The little dog wagged his tail weakly, curling closer to Mark's feet. Scout was more than a new beginning. He was a lifeline. And Mark, though he didn't fully realize it yet, was finding his way back to life. It was a bright winter morning, the kind where the sun glinted off the frost-covered ground, making the world sparkle despite the cold. Mark stepped out onto the back porch of his small Montana home, the boards creaking under his boots. Behind him, Scout waddled out, his hind legs still unsteady, but full of determination. Mark watched as the little border collie explored the backyard, sniffing at the patches of snow that remained untouched. Despite his physical limitations, Scout's enthusiasm was boundless. His tail wagged furiously as he chased an imaginary foe, his small body bounding awkwardly but happily. "All right, Scout," Mark called with a grin, holding up an old orange tennis ball he dug out of the garage. "Let's see what you can do." He tossed the ball lightly across the yard, not expecting much. To his surprise, Scout's ears perked up, and he dashed after it with surprising speed. Though his back legs wobbled, his front paws worked furiously, and he reached the ball with a triumphant bark. Grabbing it between his teeth, Scout turned and hobbled back toward Mark, his tail wagging so hard it seemed to propel him forward. "Good boy," Mark laughed, crouching down to ruffle the fur on Scout's head. "Didn't think you had it in you." Scout barked again, dropping the ball at Mark's feet and wagging his tail expectantly. The look in his eyes was unmistakable. He wanted more. For the next hour, they played fetch in the yard. Scout stumbled occasionally, his hind legs betraying him, but he refused to give up. Each time he fell, he pushed himself back up, tail wagging, determination etched into every movement. Mark couldn't help but admire the little dog's resilience. Later that day, as Mark worked on the old truck in his garage, his neighbor Rose Carter appeared at the open door. A retired schoolteacher with a soft spot for animals, Rose often dropped by to check on Mark. Today, her curiosity had been piqued by the sight of Scout bounding around the yard. "That pup of yours has spirit," Rose said, leaning against the doorframe with a warm smile. Mark wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at her. "He's got more heart than sense, that's for sure." Rose chuckled. "Have you ever thought about training him? Maybe entering him in competitions?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "Competitions? You've seen his legs. He's not exactly built for that kind of thing." Rose shook her head, undeterred. "Mark, competitions aren't just about speed or perfection. They're about heart, determination, and teamwork. That little dog has all of that and more. Don't sell him short." Mark glanced back at Scout, who was now nosing around the corner of the garage, chasing a stray leaf. His tail wagged like a metronome, and his bright eyes were full of life. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice soft. "I'm not sure we're cut out for that." Rose patted his shoulder. "Think about it. You might be surprised at what you both can accomplish." As the day turned to evening and Scout lay curled up by the fire, Mark sat on the couch, lost in thought. Rose's words echoed in his mind. Could Scout really be something more than just a rescued dog? He glanced at the little dog, now snoring softly. There was something about the way Scout had chased that ball earlier, the way he pushed through every stumble with sheer determination. Maybe Rose was right. Mark leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at his lips. "What do you say, Scout?" he murmured. "Think we've got what it takes?" Scout twitched in his sleep, his tail wagging faintly, as if answering in his dreams. The warm-up area buzzed with energy. Around Mark and Scout, sleek, polished dogs moved gracefully through practice routines, their owners dressed in matching gear and exuding confidence. Mark felt entirely out of place. His work boots scuffed against the clean floor as he looked down at Scout, who wagged his tail excitedly, oblivious to the tension around them. "Maybe this was a mistake," Mark muttered under his breath, adjusting the leash in his hands. But Scout looked up at him with trusting, eager eyes, as if to say, "We've got this." It had been weeks of preparation, practicing in the backyard and nearby fields. Despite Scout's weak hind legs, his intelligence and heart shone in every task. Rose Carter had been a constant source of encouragement, insisting they enter this local agility competition, even if only for the experience. "You're not here to win," Rose had reminded Mark that morning. "You're here to show everyone what Scout can do." Now, standing at the starting line, Mark wasn't sure they belonged here at all. The agility course looked daunting. High jumps, weaving poles, tunnels, and ramps. Scout's competition was intimidating, with strong athletic dogs whose every move seemed flawless. The judge signaled for their turn. Mark knelt beside Scout, gently scratching behind his ears. "All right, buddy," he said softly. "Let's just do our best, okay?" Scout barked once, his tail wagging furiously, and they stepped onto the course. The whistle blew. Scout launched forward, his excitement palpable. He approached the first hurdle, a low jump, and soared over it with surprising grace. Mark's heart swelled as Scout landed and sprinted toward the weaving poles. His movements were unsteady, his back legs dragging slightly, but he maneuvered through the poles with determination. The crowd began to murmur in surprise. At the tunnel, Scout hesitated for a moment before charging through, his tail wagging the whole way. The ramps proved the hardest, his back legs slipping on the incline, but each time he stumbled, he got back up. Mark's voice guided him, calm and steady. "You can do it, Scout. Keep going." By the time they reached the final hurdle, the crowd was clapping. Scout leapt, his small body defying its limitations, and landed awkwardly but triumphantly. He crossed the finish line, panting but wagging his tail as if he had conquered the world. Mark crouched down, wrapping his arms around Scout. "You did it, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." The announcer called out results, and Mark's heart sank as the winners were named. Scout's performance wasn't flawless, and they didn't place. But then the announcer's voice rang out again. "For demonstrating extraordinary heart, resilience, and teamwork, the Spirit Award goes to Scout Hudson." The crowd erupted in applause. Mark froze, stunned, as a ribbon was handed to him. He held it up for Scout, who wagged his tail so hard his entire body swayed. "This is yours, little guy," Mark said, his voice trembling with pride. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, the ribbon hanging on the mantel, Mark stroked Scout's fur. "You proved them all wrong today," he whispered. "You've got more heart than any dog out there." Scout snuggled closer, his eyes closing in contentment. Mark smiled softly, the warmth of pride and purpose filling the room. They hadn't just conquered the course, they defied the odds. Together. Scout's remarkable performance at the competition had done more than earn him a ribbon. Word of his story spread quickly. Photos of the little border collie, bounding over obstacles with unwavering determination, circulated on social media. Headlines like, "Resilient Pup Proves Love Can Overcome Any Obstacle" began to appear, and Scout became a local sensation. But not everyone saw his story as an inspiration. Far away, in his sprawling ranch outside Seattle, Richard Halstead leaned back in his leather chair, scrolling through his phone with a sour expression. A video of Scout catching the Spirit Award ribbon played on the screen. The caption read, "From Abandoned to Beloved, Scout Hudson's Journey." Richard's jaw tightened. He remembered that dog, the runt of the litter, left to die on a freezing roadside. He had dismissed it as useless. Yet now here it was, basking in attention and accolades, a beacon of hope. "That dog," he muttered, setting his phone down. He didn't see Scout as a symbol of resilience. He saw it as a missed opportunity. The fame, the recognition, it should have been his. Without hesitation, Richard picked up the phone and called his lawyer. "Find the paperwork on that litter," he barked. "I want proof of ownership for the runt." 2 weeks later, Mark was tending to Scout in the yard when the sound of tires crunching on his gravel driveway made him look up. A sleek, black SUV rolled to a stop, gleaming under the afternoon sun. Mark's heart sank. He didn't recognize the vehicle, but something about it felt wrong. Scout barked happily, oblivious to the tension in Mark's shoulders, and bounded to his side as the driver's door opened. Out stepped a man in a tailored coat, his sharp features unreadable as he scanned the yard. "Richard Halstead." "Can I help you?" Mark called, stepping forward protectively. Scout at his feet. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You already have something of mine," he said smoothly, gesturing toward Scout. "That dog belongs to me." Mark's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Richard stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel. "Scout, as you call him, is from my breeding program. He's my property. I'm here to reclaim him." Mark's fists clenched. "Your property? You abandoned him on the side of the road. I found him half dead in the snow." Richard's expression hardened. "That's a misunderstanding. He must have wandered off. But it doesn't matter. I have proof of ownership. You've had your fun, but it's time for him to come back where he belongs." Mark stepped between Richard and Scout, his voice firm. Scout doesn't belong to you. You gave up that right when you left him to die. He's my dog now, and I won't let you take him. The tension crackled in the air as the two men faced off. Richard's tone turned icy. You don't get to decide that. I have documentation, and if you don't cooperate, I'll take legal action. Mark didn't back down. Do what you have to, but you're not taking him. Richard narrowed his eyes. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. Without another word, he turned, climbed back into his SUV, and drove away. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Mark sat on the couch with Scout curled up at his feet. He stroked the dog's soft fur, his mind racing. He knew Richard wasn't bluffing. The man would use every resource he had to try and take Scout away. But Scout wasn't just a dog to Mark. He was family. Mark stared at the Spirit Award ribbon hanging on the mantel, his jaw tightening. Don't worry, Scout, he murmured. No one's taking you away. Not now, not ever. Mark didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He would fight for Scout with everything he had. This wasn't just about keeping a dog. It was about protecting the bond that had brought them both back to life. The notice came 2 days later, delivered in an envelope as cold and impersonal as its sender. Richard Halstead had filed a lawsuit claiming ownership of Scout and accusing Mark of unlawfully keeping the dog. Mark read the letter twice, his hands trembling with a mixture of anger and determination. He would fight. He had to. Scout wasn't just a dog. He was family. Mark reached out to James Miller, a local attorney known for his tenacity and passion for justice. Sitting across from Mark in his modest office, James listened intently to the story, his brow furrowing as the details unfolded. So let me get this straight, James said, leaning forward. This man left Scout to die in the snow, and now that the dog is thriving, he wants him back? Outrageous. Mark nodded. Scout was half dead when I found him. He's mine now, and I'm not letting him go. James smiled grimly. Good, we have a strong case. Let's make sure we're prepared. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. James built their defense meticulously, gathering evidence to prove that Richard had abandoned Scout. They collected animal control reports. Mark had reported finding Scout shortly after rescuing him, fulfilling his legal duty to locate the original owner. The report detailed the dog's condition and noted that no one came forward during the holding period. Photographic evidence. Mark's photos from the night he found Scout, frail, frost-covered, and trembling, painted a vivid picture of neglect. Witness testimony. Rose Carter agreed to testify, describing Scout's poor condition when Mark first brought him home and the love and care that had transformed him. The courtroom was small but packed. Mark sat beside James, his hand resting on Scout's head for comfort. Across the room, Richard sat stiffly in a tailored suit, his lawyer whispering in his ear. Scout, oblivious to the tension, wagged his tail and leaned against Mark's leg. The proceedings began with Richard's lawyer arguing that Scout had never been abandoned, but had merely wandered off. Richard claimed he had been actively searching for the dog when he discovered its location through media coverage. James was ready. Your Honor, he began, stepping forward confidently. This is not a case of a lost dog. This is a case of abandonment and neglect. My client found Scout in a condition no cared-for animal should ever endure, malnourished, injured, and left to freeze in the snow. James presented the animal control report, the photos, and Rose's testimony. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of Richard's actions or lack thereof. Under cross-examination, Richard stumbled, unable to explain how Scout had ended up miles from his property or why he had waited until the dog gained recognition to claim ownership. Finally, it was Mark's turn to speak. He recounted finding Scout on that desolate road, barely alive, and the months of care and love that followed. His voice broke as he described the bond they'd formed and how Scout had brought light back into his life. Scout isn't just a dog, Mark concluded. He's family. and family isn't something you give up. After hours of testimony, the judge delivered the verdict. This court finds sufficient evidence that Mr. Richard Halstead abandoned the dog known as Scout, forfeiting his ownership rights. Furthermore, Mr. Mark Hudson has provided exceptional care and a loving home for the animal. Custody of Scout is awarded to Mr. Hudson. The gavel struck and relief washed over Mark. He knelt beside Scout, wrapping his arms around the dog as tears welled in his eyes. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "You're staying home." Across the room, Richard stormed out, his face twisted in frustration. Mark didn't watch him go. He was too busy celebrating the victory that mattered most. That evening, back home, Mark placed Scout's Spirit Award ribbon and the court papers side by side on the mantel. He sat by the fire, Scout curled up at his feet, his tail thumping lazily against the floor. "You're home for good now," Mark said softly, scratching Scout's ears. The little dog looked up at him with those trusting eyes, and Mark smiled. The bond between man and dog had been tested but had emerged unbroken. Together, they had faced challenges and come out stronger. Scout had been abandoned once, but never again. In the quiet warmth of that evening, Mark felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. The journey wasn't over, but they would face whatever came next. Together. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest videos. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Thank you all for taking the time to watch, and see you in the next video.